Greetings and welcome to Creative Cat Productions, the real deal CCP. Have you ever heard of a YouTuber called Saga? Saga is the purple Portuguese purveyor of lesser known retro games, bootlegs, and contemporary homebrews. And if you haven't already watched his videos, and yet you like retro games, then you might want to check him out. Just check him out, dude! Personally, I love Saga for his excellent coverage of the madness that was Paprium. Yes, this Paprium, as well as his fantastic overview of the Wizardry series, games he is clearly deeply fond of. But I hate Saga too, for his outrageously lewd clickbait thumbnails, which tend to depict lots of imaginary women in sexually suggestive poses. That's a naughty boy. And I hate Saga even more for his wildly contrarian take on the console wars of the mid to late 90s. That bastard! A while back I participated in a Twitter thread created by Saga which asserted that the Sega Saturn, Sega's 32-bit follow-up to the Sega Mega Drive, was actually the best console of its generation, standing over and against the original Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 specifically. Now, I and a lot of other people took umbrage with the outrageousness of this claim. After all, the Sega Saturn was factually the biggest loser in the console war of that time period. If you don't count the Atari Jaguar, or the 3DO, or the Philips CDI, or the Apple Pippin. But is he right? Was the Sega Saturn secretly somehow the greatest video game console of the mid to late 90s? Or was it a disappointment that lots of hardcore fans and game collectors still try to make work in their crazy nostalgic imaginations? How do we even answer this question? We must engage in science. The most obvious thing to do in order to find out would be to compare the game library of the Sega Saturn against its rivals. Line up all the best console-defining games from the Sega Saturn against the Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation, and then sort of examine across multiple genres which console was better, right? But then I researched this topic extensively, and I realized fairly quickly that the Sega Saturn doesn't really have a very clear best-of library. That is, there wasn't much of a consensus online regarding what actually constitutes the must-have games for the console. When you look at the Nintendo 64, a console with a relatively small game library, it's immediately obvious which games absolutely have to be included in any of the greatest hits. It's going to be Mario, it's going to be Zelda, the stuff done by Rare, and a few other odds and ends like Star Fox or those beloved wrestling games. And when you think of the PlayStation, generally people want to talk about all the RPGs, especially Final Fantasy VII, the survival horror games, the racing games, the Tekken games, for some reason Metal Gear Solid, and a few odds and ends that actually ended up on multiple platforms. But when you think of the Saturn, it turns out that determining the essential game list is a lot harder to do. And everywhere I looked, I found people had highly divergent views about the matter. Perhaps this is because the Saturn simply had so many games. After all, the console had like 1,000 official releases, which is incredible on paper. However, the plausibility of this idea evaporates after you consider that nearly 800 of those 1,000 games were never published outside of Japan. So then, does this mean that perhaps the Sega Saturn has all these incredible hidden gems never released in North America? Amazing games that only a few people ever got to experience in the English-speaking world? That might explain why picking the best Saturn game is so darn controversial. Well, not exactly. For the sake of this video, I forced myself to wade through the Japanese catalog of Sega Saturn games across the console's first 2 years on the market, which is over 250 games released between November of 1994 and November of 1996. And what I found is that the reason most of these games were never released in North America, probably, is that they were either just terrible or lacked any sort of appeal to markets outside of Japan. For instance, of these 250 games, many of them, and I mean a lot, were actually just mahjong or shogi titles. Games like this. Lots and lots of this. There were also a lot of Japanese baseball sims, and a fair amount of re-releases of older arcade, PC, or console games. I often hear people say, including Staika, that the Sega Saturn's vast Japanese game library is this untapped goldmine of unexplored treasures, and that there's all these awesome, exclusive RPGs and so forth that are just waiting to be discovered and collected. But from my experience, at least looking over the first 2 years of the Saturn's existence, with little exception, this Japanese game library was abysmal. And no, actually, there weren't many good Japanese RPGs, which weren't eventually released for either North America or the Sony PlayStation. But so you don't have to just take my word for it, I went ahead and picked out a random selection of 25 games from the over 250 games never released in North America, which I examined for this video. And so without further ado, I present, briefly, 25 random Japanese Sega Saturn games.
知らない人のために念のため自己紹介をさせていただきます。名前は榊優子。
あの壊れた時計どこにしまったっけな。誰だ。
Wow, that really did kind of suck. To be honest, I actually really like Konami's Proteus and KO Flying Squadron 2.
Here you go!
But the rest of these were just terrible. Somehow I managed to pull both Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the Angel Paradise series, which are both nothing more than worthless pornography. And obviously this was not very likely, but it really did happen. Anyway, so no, I don't think the reason people struggle to come up with a definitive list of the best games for the Sega Saturn has anything to do with the vastness of the less explored Japanese game catalog. I don't think hardly any of these games are actually worth playing. They only seem to exist because CD-ROMs are dirt cheap to produce, and therefore a lot of crappy publishers tried to make a quick buck. This leads me to consider the following controversial hypothesis. Perhaps, just maybe, the reason there doesn't seem to be a very broad consensus regarding which Sega Saturn games are essential is that there simply aren't enough Sega Saturn games in existence that even fall into that category. That is to say, perhaps the Saturn just doesn't have enough truly must-have system-selling games to speak of. Wouldn't this explain, ultimately, why the Saturn failed so miserably in North America? Even if it doesn't explain how it was simultaneously supposedly so popular in Japan? Outside of all this porn, of course. Japan is really weird. But in order to test this, I still had to put together some kind of list of Sega Saturn games to look at. And so what I did was go on Twitter, or X, or whatever it's called, and ask as many Sega Saturn fans as I could what they themselves would rate as the 5 must-have games for the Sega Saturn. I went through all of their feedback and then I counted up the number of times that a particular game was nominated as a top 5 Sega Saturn game. I ended up getting responses from 40 different people, which is admittedly a pretty small sample size, but at the same time, a clear and distinct picture began to emerge, and looking at it I think you'll agree, kind of makes sense. And while virtually no one gave the same list of 5 must-have games twice, some of the same names kept coming up over and over again. So let's go through the top 10 games that were mentioned the most number of times as being must-have, essential, the very best for the Sega Saturn, and then ask whether or not, indeed, these games had the potential to make the Sega Saturn the real best console of its day. Number 10. Saturn Bomberman. Saturn Bomberman was named as a top 5 Saturn game 10 different times in my survey. Saturn Bomberman was released in Hudson Soft in North America in September of 1997, which was about 2 years and 4 months after the release of the Sega Saturn. So it was a fairly late release for the Saturn, which was discontinued by March of 1998. It's often pointed out that Saturn Bomberman was supposed to be released in North America much earlier, but that it was delayed in order to make the game compatible with Sega's Netlink modem, which enabled up to 4 players to play the game simultaneously online. A cool trick that was way ahead of its time, considering how primitive the internet still was at this point. Despite the wait, Saturn Bomberman came out to critical acclaim, and it went on to be regarded by many fans as the very best game in the series, even to this very day. But what makes Saturn Bomberman so special? I mean, at first glance, it's not all that different from any of the other versions of Bomberman from the first half of the 1990s. Bomberman is a terrorist in a spacesuit that uses bombs to destroy blocks and clear enemies on single-screen stages. Sometimes blowing up a block will reveal power-ups, changing up gameplay a little bit. Saturn Bomberman in particular has these cute little dinosaurs that hatch from eggs. You can ride them around the stage, and if you get hit, they represent an extra hit point, which is sort of sad, because they have to make the ultimate sacrifice. Thanks, little buddy. See you on the other side, dude. The main objective of Saturn Bomberman's either 1 or 2 player story mode is to blow up these flashing red targets. This sounds almost stupid simple, and it kind of is, but Saturn Bomberman offers a lot of quirky environments with unique conditions that add to the family fun.
We're here to have family fun.
For instance, in the very first level, there are train tracks running across the playing field. On another level, with pirate ships, you can use bombs to trigger these cannons. Also just like in real life. Saturn Bomberman is overflowing with all sorts of fun little details like this, and that's great. After a few stages, there's an obligatory boss fight, and then you're off to the next quirky, colorful environment. Rinse and repeat. But let's be real, no one plays Saturn Bomberman because of the story mode. Like all Bomberman games, the real fun to be had is found in murdering your friends, in competitive multiplayer, and it's here that Saturn Bomberman really has earned its reputation as one of the greatest games for the Sega Saturn. You get a lot of fun options. You can group into teams, you can play a free-for-all, you can make it so that the loser hangs out at the edge of society, throwing bombs at all the normal people, also just like in real life. But what really sets Saturn Bomberman apart is the fact that if you actually have 2 different Saturn multi-taps, 10 different Saturn controllers, 1 very large television screen, at least 9 other people to invite over, and a keg of beer, you can have simultaneous 10-player super battles. More exciting plays than the Super Bowl, more burned meat than a luau, Saturn Bomberman is the ultimate way to party without ending up in jail or naked in your neighbor's front yard. Only by Hudson Soft. You know, everyone that talks about this game always flaunts the Saturn's 10-player Bomberman battles. And it really does sound awesome, but who honestly ever did this? Outside of video game journalists who actually had access to all this stuff in their mid-90s offices before the dot-com bubble burst, I think the truth is that 10-player Saturn Bomberman was probably too far-fetched, too hard to freaking see. I mean, look how tiny everything is. And too hectic to actually be that enjoyable. But 4 and 5 player Bomberman, as always, that's just absolutely awesome to play. Getting some friends and family together to play Bomberman like this really is, truly, one of the funnest things ever made possible with video games. Aesthetically, Bomberman games have always been simple and colorful.
Saturn Bomberman
is probably the very best in the series, ever, with a lot of extra frames of animation, and lots of people love the quirky soundtrack by the eccentric and highly talented Jun Chikuma, one of the world's foremost experts on traditional Tunisian and Arabic music. And I'm not trying to be funny, that's actually true. So obviously, Saturn Bomberman is a great game for Bomberman fans. But was it really a must-play game for the console? The kind of game that justifies the purchase of a $400 Sega Saturn? Unfortunately, no. Not when you consider the late release date and the fact that similar Bomberman games were readily available on other consoles that people likely already had. For instance, Mega Bomberman was released on the Sega Genesis earlier in 1995. And despite being on older hardware, Mega Bomberman looks, sounds, and plays every bit as good as Saturn Bomberman. And with the Sega Genesis multi-tap, it was possible to engage in fun 4-player battles, which are much easier to follow and therefore more fun to play than the tiny squished 10-player option on the Saturn. Of course, Nintendo fans also had the option of playing Super Bomberman on the Super Nintendo as early as the fall of 1993. And while Super Bomberman is technically inferior to either Saturn Bomberman or Mega Bomberman, with the multi-tap, it's still allowed for the outstanding fun of the multiplayer Bomberman experience for up to 5 players, which was really more than enough. Worse still, in December of 1997, only 3 months after the release of Saturn Bomberman, Hudson Soft released Bomberman 64 for the Nintendo 64. A true next-generation iteration of Bomberman that took the series in an authentically new direction. Maybe it was ultimately a deviation too far, playing more like a 3D action game from the same era. But at the time, this was manifestly the more fashionable choice, and unlike the Sega Saturn, the N64 came standard with 4 controller ports, making multiplayer battles more accessible than ever. If Saturn Bomberman had come out sooner than Bomberman 64, and had it differentiated itself a little more from Mega Bomberman or Bomberman 93 or Super Bomberman, then it really could have stood out as an essential Sega Saturn game. But the truth is, even if you don't have a Saturn and you love Bomberman, then you are going to be just fine without it. Number 9. Fighters MegaMix. 11 out of 40 of my respondents said that Fighters MegaMix was one of the 5 most essential games for the Sega Saturn, which actually surprised me because of how incredibly well liked this game was by both critics and Sega Saturn owners back when it came out in May of 1997. Fighters MegaMix was praised as a Sega fan's dream come true, combining all of the characters from Sega AM2's biggest and baddest 3D fighting games into one massive game, Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers, both together at last. And it was pretty great, because not only did you get the full roster of characters from both Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers, but you also got to play as the boss characters of both games from the start. And you could eventually unlock an amazing 32 character roster, which gave Fighters MegaMix a ton of replay value. To put this into perspective, the other best fighting games from the time period had much smaller rosters. Tekken 2 for the Sony PlayStation, released the year before, had 7 less characters to choose from in total. Puny! Super Street Fighter 2 only had 16 characters. Forget about it! And when Tekken 3 hit the arcades in 1997, it only had 23 characters. That's 9 less than Fighters MegaMix. Don't make me laugh. More is more, right? Well, not exactly. While Fighters MegaMix was in fact a well-executed and fun concept, it turns out that combining 2 slightly different playing 3D fighting games into one was also a little bit clunky from a gameplay perspective. And some of the more polished gameplay elements that help make Virtua Fighter 2 one of the all-time greats are missing from Fighters MegaMix. For instance, there are no ring outs. And the hit detection between all of these zany characters is not as polished as one would expect from Sega AM2. And let's talk about some of these characters. Yes, there are some great fan-serving additions, such as the dude from Rent-A-Hero and the lady from Virtual Cop, who can actually use her gun. Unlike a real lady cop, am I right? Anyway, talk about some deep cuts. But also, a lot of these 32 characters are just plain wacky. Like, a little too wacky. You can play as Bean the Duck from Dynamite Ducks. You can play as a giant Mexican pickle. Or why not play as a piece of freaking meat for some reason? Or how about a comical bear without arms and legs that can actually bend or change shape as he moves? Or what about the Sega AM2 palm tree logo? Are they serious? But probably the most famous character in Fighters MegaMix is the car from Daytona, USA. Yes, you heard me correctly. You can play as the freaking car from Daytona, USA. It stands up on its back wheels and throws punches and everything. And you know something? Though it's amusing to see for about a minute, as an actual fighter, this thing is worse than useless. He has no attack range whatsoever, and his moves are all terrible. Most of these crazy unlockable characters are little more than a throwaway sight gag that added painfully little to the actual gameplay. What's more baffling is that Sega passed over the opportunity to include a number of classic characters from all their other franchises, including Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Fighter was an arcade fighting game from 1996 that included characters from the Sonic universe. And really, the concept would have fit in perfectly here. Why make room for a Mexican pickle and the car from Daytona, USA, when you could have added Sonic or Knuckles? Further, what about the cast of characters from Streets of Rage, or Golden Axe, or Shinobi? With just a few more major Sega icons, Fighters MegaMix could have been a Sega fan's wildest dream come true. Well, second wildest dream. Everyone knows our first wildest dream was to one day take a ride on Uriah the Dragon. Fighters MegaMix also takes a hit when it comes to graphical resolution, especially when compared to Virtua Fighter 2, a game that was released approximately 18 months earlier, which is pretty darn close to 2 years. 2 years! And I think that's fundamentally the big problem here. Yes, Fighters MegaMix is a good 3D fighting game from the time period. It had a huge roster of characters, despite the fact that a lot of them were, well, kinda stupid, and it introduced really nice gameplay mechanics that were in development for Virtua Fighter 3. Specifically, the long overdue ability to sidestep your opponent. Imagine playing a three-dimensional fighting game where you don't have the ability to simply just get the hell out of the way. But at the same time, by 1997, the ultimate failure of the Saturn itself was a foregone conclusion, and no one except die-hard Sega fans were going to be interested in playing a game combining the rosters of two pre-existing games that pretty much every Sega Saturn owner already owned and played: Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers. So in this slide, I guess it's not that surprising that few people mentioned this as one of the 5 essential Sega Saturn games of all time. But that's not to say Fighters MegaMix wasn't still good. It was. It's just that it was way too much of the same thing, released way too late to really matter. Sometimes people will compare Fighters MegaMix to Super Smash Bros. On the N64, because after all, both games mixed and matched characters from within the world of Sega and Nintendo respectively. But I don't think this comparison makes much sense beyond that. In terms of actual gameplay, we're really talking about two completely different genres here. Fighters MegaMix is a true blue 3D fighting game, and there was really nothing on the N64 that could even remotely compete with this until 1998, and I'm not sure calling it competition was even accurate. The Sega Saturn absolutely mopped the floor with the N64 in this department. However, the Sony PlayStation was a little different, and I think that Fighters MegaMix can be favorably compared to either Tekken 2 or Tekken 3. Which was better? It's hard to say. They're both good games, but my personal preference would be to go with Fighters MegaMix. I just wish it included more relevant Sega characters instead of a big green Mexican pickle. Wait, doesn't that make him a jalapeno? Number 8. Panzer Dragoon Zwei. Panzer Dragoon Zwei was named a top 5 Sega Saturn game by 12 out of 40 people in my survey. Panzer Dragoon Zwei was released in North America in April of 1996, just under a year after the original Panzer Dragoon was released as one of the Sega Saturn's original launch games in North America in May of 1995. Both Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Zwei were the creation of Team Andromeda, a short-lived division at Sega that was exclusively dedicated to making the first 3 Panzer Dragoon games for the Sega Saturn. Prior to that, the team's leader, Yukio Furusugi, had proven himself as an assistant working on the development of Shinobi for the Game Gear, and after leaving Sega in the late 90s, he was known for, well, being the guy that worked on the first 3 Panzer Dragoon games for the Sega Saturn. Panzer Dragoon Zwei was the second of these 3 games, and if you know any German, hallo, then you would realize this right away because the word Zwei just means number 2 in German. Ja, das ist so einfach. I don't know what it is about the Japanese and the Germans, but they just seem to get along so very, very well. Anyway, does Zwei live up to its name? Is it a good number 2? Panzer Dragoon Zwei is very similar to the original, Panzer Dragoon 1, but now there are branching paths, ground-based levels, and the ability to upgrade your dragon into increasingly powerful forms. The game also featured slightly improved graphics and sound from the original, and it built upon the mythos of the Panzer Dragoon world, which I suppose really interested some people in the 1990s. So did Pogs! Whoa! Das problem with the original is that Panzer Dragoon Zwei is a rail shooter. Think about that for a moment. A rail shooter, a genre from the mid-80s that was the video game equivalent of one of those baby-friendly dark rides at Disneyland. You know the ones where you passively sit in a box that's set in a little track that moves you around a dimly lit warehouse full of dioramas based on classic movies? Sometimes they even give you something to do, like a pretend gun, and that's what we have here. And yet, this somehow is one of the best games on the Saturn? How? In Panzer Dragoon Zwei, there is a dude that rides a laser-firing dragon in a fully 3D environment. This sounds awesome, until you start playing and realize that you have very little actual control over the dragon. The dragon moves on a predetermined path within which you have only a modest amount of lateral freedom. Much less than other rail shooters like Star Fox 64, where being able to maneuver your vehicle is central to the gameplay. The main thing the player controls is the little aiming reticule that you move with the D-pad. You move it over targets and then spam the fire button, or the missiles, until all your enemies are defeated. Panzer Dragoon Zwei is a very simple, very repetitive arcade-style game with good production values. But I have little else to say positive in its favor other than that it has cool atmosphere that was inspired by the psychedelic artwork of Jean Girard, also known as Mobius, as well as Frank Herbert's Dune, and a lot of other interesting sources. I don't really like the gameplay, but I have to admit, Panzer Dragoon games are, at the very least, aesthetically very interesting. But the truth is, on any other console, this game would have been totally forgotten. Because again, it's a rail shooter, and rail shooters just aren't all that interesting, because the player has almost nothing to do to engage them. You can't explore the environment, you can't actually outmaneuver your enemies. All you can really do is move a cursor and shoot. In terms of gameplay, this makes Panzer Dragoon Zwei on par with just about any 2D shooter from the early 80s, prior to the advent of scrolling stages. I'd rather play virtually any space shooter other than Panzer Dragoon Zwei. Older, more primitive games like R-Type, for instance, gave you much more maneuverability and freedom, and therefore, they were far more interesting to play. Shoot, I'd rather play the original Space Harrier. Some people love Panzer Dragoon Zwei, but I'm not one of them. However, was Panzer Dragoon Zwei a decent contender for being a top 5 must-have Sega Saturn game in 1996? Well, at the time especially, yeah, sure, why not? I could see this game being that for some people. It was an improvement over the original, it was an iconic Saturn exclusive, and it's honestly the sort of thing that people seem to actually want from the Saturn at the time. 3D polygonal anything was good enough, I suppose. So sure, this game kinda makes sense. Number 7, Shining Force 3. Shining Force 3 was called a top 5 Sega Saturn game by 14 out of 40 respondents in my survey, and it is an extremely late release for the Sega Saturn, finally coming out in North America at the end of July in 1998, several months after the console was officially discontinued. In fact, Shining Force 3 was the second to last Saturn game ever released in North America. The very last game, incidentally, would be Magic Knight Rayearth in December of 1998, which is actually a pretty interesting game in its own right, but I'm sorry and a little surprised to say that it won't be covered in this video. However, we can say that the Sega Saturn went out with a premature bang in the second half of 1998, about a year before the launch of the Sega Dreamcast in 1999. So let's consider Shining Force 3, and not Magic Knight Rayearth, because it was a pretty good consolation prize, and a great way to put the Saturn in America to bed. Go to bed, little buddy. Shh. Shining Force is one of the 2 greatest RPG franchises to ever grace a Sega console. The most famous is probably Sega's own Phantasy Star, the greatest 8-bit JRPG ever made. But this is Shining Force, a lighthearted turn-based strategy RPG game for the Mega Drive that first hit North America in the summer of 1993. However, this game was itself the quasi-sequel to Shining in the Darkness, an old-school dungeon crawler released in 1991 that featured beautiful 16-bit artwork that looked like it was ripped out of a classic Walt Disney film, or at the very least, a slightly less classic Don Bluth movie. And the same was true for most every other game in the franchise. Shining Force 2 in October of 1994, and Shining CD in 1995, which was itself an excellent compilation of not 1, but 2 Game Gear games of a similar vibe. The Shining Force games were excellent, light on story and character development, but heavy on personality and fun, addictive, highly accessible, semi-strategic gameplay. Essentially, you're in charge of a little customizable 16-bit army of about a dozen characters, each with their own character classes, replete with unique strengths and weaknesses. Some were physically weak but could cast powerful spells, others had limited range of motion but could take and deal massive amounts of physical damage. Put your toughest fighters in the front and keep your archers in the back, etc, etc. It's very fun, and it continues to be regarded as being amongst the very best Sega games of all time. But this is Shining Force 3 on the Sega Saturn, and there are some big changes. some for the better, and some for the not so better. Most obvious is the fact that this is now a three-dimensional game experience, and like all 3D games of this era, it kinda looks like fuzzy dog shit. However, I assure you, at the time, this was actually fairly beautiful fuzzy dog shit. The worst visual compromise of all comes with the battle scenes, which used to look like this. Beautiful 16-bit cartoons. Now they all look like this, like an early 80s prog rock video on MTV. Not very impressive, but I guess it's still interesting. The advantage of 3D, however, is that Shining Force 3 has full-blown 3D environments, and the ability to rotate the camera and explore 3D towns, and a unique fantasy-rich world. This aspect alone offers up to about half the fun of this game, because exploration in 3D is just better. Shining Force 3 isn't necessarily as charming as the original, and it's not, but there is definitely a lot more to explore and see through the simple ability to rotate the camera, and that's great too. But massive amounts of text and dialogue to read through, another feature of this same time period, well, that really isn't better. Unlike previous lighthearted entries in the series, Shining Force 3 has a Leo Tolstoy level of slogging through endless expository text and dialogue between a confusing cacophony of characters all engaged in intricate political intrigue. The talking in Shining Force 3 goes on way too long. It feels like it takes an entire hour of story and dialogue before you even enter into any actual gameplay. And while I know a lot of people think stuff like this is a big plus, the truth is, it's a video game from 1998, so no, it is not a plus. None of this is remotely compelling or interesting to me. Maybe in comparison to like the original Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, Shining Force 3 would be this epic masterpiece. But compared to like any good book that you've ever read or a good movie, it's just awful. And the voice acting in this game is lazy to the point of being embarrassing.
Now bear my Arctic Blast.
However, once you finally make it into the actual gameplay, well, it's Shining Force, and Shining Force remains as fun as ever. Unfortunately, Shining Force 3 is a bit of an odd duck, in that the original Japanese version of the game was produced as 3 separate scenarios. That is, 3 separate games that were intended to be played back to back, culminating in one massive complete story, as told from the perspective of 3 different main characters. In the end, all the threads are supposedly brought together into what amounts to an actual climax, which this version of Shining Force 3 is completely missing, because this is only scenario number 1, and the other 2 scenarios were never released in North America. That being said, Shining Force 3 is a fairly impressive addition to the Shining Force series, especially for the time period. At the same time, however, it's only the first third of a massively ambitious monster of a game, and the burdensome emphasis on plot and dialogue sorely detract from everything that made the original Shining Force so fun in the first place. That is, accessibility and the ability to quickly pick it up and put it down. But would this really have been one of the must-have games for the Sega Saturn in the 1990s? Not really. Shining Force 3 is incomplete, and it came out way too late in the system's lifespan to actually matter. Indeed, as a consequence, Shining Force 3 remains rare and is one of the hardest to collect games on the Sega Saturn. Number 6, Virtua Fighter 2! Virtua Fighter 2 was called a top 5 essential game for the Sega Saturn by only 14 out of 40 people who responded to my inquiry, which is the same number of people who named Shining Force 3. This really surprised me, because it's always been my understanding that Virtua Fighter 2 was one of the very best games on the system, a close to perfect arcade conversion of one of the best fighting games of all time that simultaneously served as a technological showcase, proving to naysayers that the Sega Saturn had as much potential on offer as the competition. I've always thought of Virtua Fighter 2 as the Sega Saturn's real deal system seller. The original Virtua Fighter arcade game was released to arcades in 1993, and to say it was influential would be a gross understatement. Not only is Virtua Fighter the first fighting game to ever utilize 3D polygons, ever, it's also one of the first true 3D games ever made, period. And indeed, Sony producer Ryoji Akagawa has been quoted as saying that it was only after seeing what Sega did with Virtua Fighter in the arcades that Sony decided to steer development of the original PlayStation entirely towards 3D gameplay. Wow, so like why in the heck didn't Sega think of doing the same thing when, you know, they pioneered the freaking technology? Probably because Sega didn't think home video game consoles could be produced cheaply enough to utilize this kind of technology. I've heard it said that Virtua Fighter arcade cabinets, utilizing the so-called Sega Model 1 motherboard, weighed around 400 pounds, making the game amongst the heaviest and most cumbersome to move and work with in the industry. I mean, just look at all that silicone loaded onto this monster. This is what the Sega Model 1 actually looked like. Would you really have thought that anyone was going to be able to turn this into consumer electronics? What a difference a few years makes, right? But this was the original Virtua Fighter, and in 1993, it was very good. Kinda ugly, slow, and a tad cumbersome with all these wonky input commands that you had to memorize. But if you really took the time to master it and found an equally dorky human opponent to play with, then matches in this game could be spectacularly fun and truly competitive. Just like Pogs! Whoa! And given how big arcades were in Japan, both figuratively and literally, you can imagine that a hyper-competitive fighting game might be very popular over there. And in fact, it really was. Indeed, Virtua Fighter for the Sega Saturn was so exciting to the Japanese public that its existence was sufficient to automatically crown the Sega Saturn as the winner of the console wars in Japan, at least for about the first couple of years or so. Yes, eventually Sony would surpass the success of the Sega Saturn in Japan, and by a wide margin, but for a brief, glorious moment, Virtua Fighter reigned supreme. But in North America, the appeal of Virtua Fighter has never been what it was in Japan, and therefore the Saturn only sold around 1.2 million units over here, as compared to Japan's 5.8 million units sold. That is to say, for every one Sega Saturn sold in North America, the Japanese market sold 5. That's a remarkable difference. And I think everything about this disparity can be explained by the fact that Virtua Fighter was the Saturn pack-in game in both Japan and North America. Japan, the arcade capital of the world, freaking loved Virtua Fighter. And Western gamers, well, we were just a lot more lukewarm about it. But I think it didn't help matters much that Virtua Fighter was pretty freaking ugly to look at. Even when the game came out in 1993, it was not the prettiest game in the world.
The most asked question I get is, how are you so beautiful?
And by 1995, we had seen games like Tekken, which, while less technically interesting to play, is obviously leagues ahead of Virtua Fighter in terms of graphics, thanks to its smoothly animated, textured polygons. And you could get Tekken exclusively on the Sony PlayStation in November of 1995. But making matters worse, much worse, is that the Sega Saturn port of Virtua Fighter just looked terrible, even compared to the original. Its frame rate chugged and stuttered, the polygons in the arena were constantly clipping and flickering. It was not pretty. Yes, it was still fun to play, but the game was also already on the older side, being a 2-year-old arcade game that had already had its time in the limelight, and thus, it was a tough sell. Allegedly, the reason for the weak graphical performance was the fact that the port was rushed, and Sega AM2 was split between working on both this game and their surprisingly amazing 32X port. So I guess this was just all they could manage to accomplish prior to the launch. It was so bad that Sega of America went and issued copies of a drastically improved texture map version of the game, called Virtua Fighter Remix, to thousands of registered Sega Saturn owners in North America, completely for free. This was almost done as a kind of apology, in fact. But Virtua Fighter 2 is nothing like that. Compared to the dated pack-in game, Virtua Fighter 2 came off as a polished, full-forced effort on the part of Sega. Virtua Fighter 2 was also a relatively early release for the Sega Saturn, coming out just in time for Christmas in late November of 1995, and at the time, critics and gamers alike were all about this very impressive fighting game. It was, in every way, an amazing port of a cutting-edge arcade classic, and it was a massive improvement upon the original. Beyond the major graphical upgrades, including the amazingly fast and smooth 60 frames per second gameplay, Virtua Fighter 2 also offered a ton of new moves, 2 great new characters, new gameplay modes, crisp and responsive controls, and a drastically improved AI that could learn to work around any of your overly used patterns during single-player gameplay. As a consequence, many would declare both Virtua Fighter 2 and its solid Saturn port to be one of the greatest fighting games ever made, and I totally agree. However, despite the many accolades, Virtua Fighter 2 only sold about 500,000 copies in the United States, which is actually very good, but nowhere near as impressive as the 1.7 million copies the game managed to sell in Japan. To put this in perspective, the port of the original Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis, despite being inferior in virtually every single way, sold an astonishing 3.25 million copies. The fact of the matter is that despite the quality of the Virtua Fighter games, they were just never that popular in North America. They were too complex, had too high of a learning curve, were maybe just a little too dorky, and none of these games allowed you to rip your opponent's head clean off of their body, along with, somehow, a partially intact spinal cord. This isn't medically accurate, by the way. So is Virtua Fighter 2 a good candidate for being called one of the Sega Saturn's essential must-have games? Oh, you bet. Even after all these years, Virtua Fighter 2 is easily one of the best fighting games of its generation. It might even be, from a technical standpoint, the very best. I don't know how people could possibly not consider Virtua Fighter 2 a top 5 Sega Saturn game, but I'm guessing it has everything to do with the fact that the series was just, basically, underappreciated outside of Japan. Listen, of all the weird things that the Japanese have been able to convince Westerners to do, everything from spending our evenings fighting in thick cotton pajamas, to paying a premium to eat uncooked fish, to driving their reliable yet vanilla plastic cars, to spending our days watching cartoon characters kill each other while making irritating screeching noises. You'd think that Japan would have no trouble convincing us to play one of the best Sega arcade games ever made. But I guess not everything from Japan is automatically going to be worshipped by Westerners. And perhaps that can be a good thing too. Number 5. Panzer Dragoon Saga. 16 out of 40 people surveyed for this video declared Panzer Dragoon Saga one of the Sega Saturn's 5 must-play games. And for good reason. The Sega Saturn did not get a lot of very good RPGs in North America. For my money, the very best RPG released on the console is Shining the Holy Ark, released in North America in the summer of 1997. However, Shining the Holy Ark is an old-school first-person perspective dungeon crawler, the sequel to Shining in the Darkness, a game that was old-school even in 1991. Thus, despite Shining the Holy Ark's amazing graphics, puzzles, and 3D locations, it's still true that not too many people will love playing this genre the way I do. You have to be a little weird and neurotic to be able to appreciate this game. Dungeon crawlers are pretty hyper-focused on grinding and navigating long, difficult corridors at the expense of much storytelling, character development, or unnecessary interpersonal communication. Just the way I like it. I guess you could say that the dungeon crawler is to RPGs what the rail shooter is to flying games, or shooters. Flat, repetitive, and maybe for most people, just a little boring. And that brings us to Panzer Dragoon Saga, an RPG released about 1 month after the Sega Saturn was officially canceled by Sega in April of 1998. Almost 2 years after the release of Mario 64 for the N64, almost 8 months after the release of Final Fantasy VII for the Sony PlayStation, and nearly 7 months before the release of The Legend of Zelda, The Ocarina of Time. Panzer Dragoon Saga is the third entry in the Panzer Dragoon series, and the very first and last game in the series to not be an on-rails shooter. At the time of its release, Panzer Dragoon Saga, thanks to its unique immersive aesthetic and emphasis on 3D exploration, was hailed as one of the greatest games ever published on the Sega Saturn, and one of the best RPGs of all time. Electronic Gaming Monthly, for instance, gave the game a nearly perfect score across multiple editors. And I have to say, I can kind of see the appeal. especially looking back through the lens of those magical years between 1996 and 2000, when game critics blindly fawned all over any 3D polygonal gameplay, even when these games all played like having cinder blocks glued to your shoes and looked like a kaleidoscope of stained glass smothered in Vaseline. My eyes! Oh, my eyes! But as awful as this looks by today's standards, and the standards of 1993, my biggest problem with the Panzer Dragoon series was never the 3D graphics, but rather it was the pointlessness of playing a game that looks like a 3D flying game, but which only allows you to control a reticule for shooting enemies. That's just so boring. Panzer Dragoon Saga, however, finally grants the player the ability to actually control a flying dragon in a largish 3D environment that is rich with inspired visual flair, even while it remains provocatively barren and equipped with, sadly, few interesting places to actually visit and explore. It reminds me of Shenmue, or the Ocarina of Time, in that it will initially overwhelm you with the sense of vast wonder, only for reality to come crashing back down upon you in the form of a monotonous forklift simulator. And Panzer Dragoon Saga's forklift simulator comes in the form of its excessively random and repetitive JRPG combat. Panzer Dragoon Saga's combat is now largely menu-driven and turn-based, though you can still maneuver around your enemies for strategic advantage, which is, once again, a major departure for the series. And I think this is a pretty good trade because flying around the colorful dungeons, with their many tunnels, or traversing the desolate overworld, is far more interesting than simply aiming a reticule while stuff just happens all around you. I wish it were an action RPG. I wish the encounter rate were lower. I wish the encounters required more strategy than just spamming the same basic attacks, but at the very least, it's still a major improvement to be able to actually explore these mysterious 3D environments without being forced on a freaking rail. And that bleak post-apocalyptic art design of the Panzer Dragoon series really works here. It captures the imagination. It stirs the soul's need for wonder, and it does a good job of hiding the truth that, beyond its colorful dungeons, the 3D graphics in this game are just not very good at all. This is especially true of the portions where you have to actually walk around away from your dragon. I mean, just look at this. This is ugly, clunky, and awkward, even for the time period. I mean, reconsider the fact that Panzer Dragoon Saga came out the same year as the Ocarina of Time, and 2 years after the release of Mario 64, and tell me how anyone thought this kind of 3D game design was perfectly acceptable. However, many of the cinematic cutscenes, apart from the human character models, look absolutely stunning in terms of their cinematic execution. Obviously, Team Andromeda really cared about the craft of filmmaking and animation, and the boss fights are a sight to behold. It's not always clear what you're supposed to be beholding, but the scale is definitely impressive. Okay, so the gameplay is easy, hyper-repetitive, and stale. The graphics, while interesting, are honestly not very good. Therefore, the saving grace of Panzer Dragoon Saga must be the amazing storyline then. No, not really. The gratuitous JRPG storyline here is a vague jumbled mess of mid-90s anime cliches. You're a very young mercenary soldier named Edge. Yes, his name is Edge. And you're out guarding the MacGuffin when one day the evil Empire shows up and kills some of the people that we're told Edge cares about. So now Edge has no choice, I guess, but to go on a journey of revenge. And so it's a really convenient and good thing that Edge is also randomly rescued by the power of the Divine Visitor and given a dragon to explore the world with. But soon it turns out that the evil Empire isn't the really real bad guy, but it's all the work of this rogue madman with an apocalyptic vision to harness a powerful ancient magical technology that will create a new world order. And then, of course, it turns out that everything hinges upon capturing this one magical girl, who alone contains the secret to accessing the ultimate power. And she and Edge are also in love, because that would make everything more epic and dramatic. This story, which has been repeated in more than one Final Fantasy game, totally sucks. However, that doesn't mean the world of Panzer Dragoon Saga isn't still fun to explore and fly around in, because it is. And this is by far the most expansive and ambitious game ever made as an exclusive title for the Sega Saturn. On top of that, the music here just absolutely rocks. If you like exploring 3D fantasy worlds, or you like JRPGs, then Panzer Dragoon Saga probably really is a must-play game for the console. For everyone else though, it's not nearly as good as it's always been hyped up to be. It's not the best RPG from the time period, and it's not the best original RPG on the Saturn either. That honor once again belongs to Shining the Holy Ark or perhaps Shining Force 3. But wait, there's more! Given how interesting Panzer Dragoon Saga is, and it really is, I would love to say that this qualifies as a top 5 must-play Sega Saturn game. However, due to languishing sales and a lack of interest, Sega hardly published any copies of this game in English. The real number has been obscured by time, but estimates regarding the actual number of copies of the North American version of Panzer Dragoon Saga to even exist range from about 20,000 to 25,000. Think about that. Sega only published, at most, 25,000 copies of Panzer Dragoon Saga in North America. This means that only 1.4% of all American Sega Saturn owners would have even been able to play this game. To put it another way, almost 99% of Sega Saturn owners wouldn't have been able to play Panzer Dragoon Saga even if they really wanted to. In other words, the game practically doesn't even exist, which has led to it becoming one of the great holy grails of hardcore video game collecting. Copies of this mythical beast go for thousands of dollars on eBay. So is Panzer Dragoon Saga a top 5 Saturn game? Maybe as a collector's item, sure, this game is pretty cool. If you can afford it, put that sealed copy over your mantle, I guess. But as an actual game, which would have historically convinced consumers to buy the console? No way, dudes. You can't play a game if it practically doesn't exist. No, Panzer Dragoon just doesn't count. 99% of gamers wouldn't have even been able to touch it. I consider it disqualified. Disqualified! Number 4. And now for my personal favorite Sega Saturn game, Guardian Heroes. And I'm not alone in thinking this because 16 out of 40 people all agreed with me that Guardian Heroes is one of the top 5 must-play games for the Sega Saturn. Guardian Heroes was released in North America in April of 1996, just over a year after the console's surprise launch in May of 1995. Thus, it's safe to say that this is one of the early must-have titles for the system and would have been one of Sega's most important arguments against either the Nintendo 64 or the Sony PlayStation. And wouldn't you know it, it's a 2D game. A 2D game in 1996? What? Is that even legal? Yes. Guardian Heroes was developed by Treasure, the guys behind Alien Soldier, Gunstar Heroes, and McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure. And so rather than just do what everyone else was doing, with all them 3D polygons and such, they rebelled and instead turned out a 2D action game that remains one of the most original ever made. Guardian Heroes is frequently described as a 2D beat-em-up, but in fact I think it plays a lot more like a 2D fighting game crossed with a JRPG. In a traditional beat-em-up, you fight bad guys by positioning your sprite in just the right place and executing a combo or a few simple-to-remember attacks. Winning is all about good positioning, personal endurance, and avoiding being surrounded. Guardian Heroes, on the other hand, is more about which 2D plane you're occupying, which direction you're facing, and most importantly, which crazy techniques and combos you choose to employ for the circumstances. And each character can perform an array of different moves on the basis of memorized button commands, akin to any standard fighting game from the time period. So it's safe to say that down, forward, and then B is going to make your character do something awesome. But this also means that while basic attacks and hopping between the 2D foreground and the backgrounds are as easy as the press of a button, the most effective and useful attacks in the game are all going to require some research, memorization, and practice before you'll be able to get the most out of Guardian Heroes. This might sound awful, but I think it actually adds to the replayability of what is already one of the Sega Saturn's most charmingly replayable games ever. You can play as one of 4 different characters, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. I like the big dude, Han, because I'm a traditionalist of sorts, but the little magic user, Randy, has some really impressive magical skills that are a blast to explore. And then this guy is a freaking ninja, so you know he's a badass. And this one is a girl. She does girl things. On top of that, 2 players can simultaneously play through the colorful story mode, which is unveiled like you're watching an anime, and unlike a lot of other story-driven games from the time period, this time the story doesn't completely suck. On top of that, the player can make choices throughout the game that not only determine what happens next, and how the game ends, but you can also choose to be more or less aligned with either good or evil throughout each adventure. This means there's a lot of content to explore that can only be accessed through a lot of different playthroughs. So even though beating the game can be done in less than 90 minutes, you'll have to beat this a lot of different times in order to see every possible level, every possible boss or sub-boss encounter, and every possible ending. But wait, there's more! Guardian Heroes also contains a fairly well-developed versus mode that lets you turn this 2D brawler into a full-blown fighting game within the game, allowing up to 6 2D sprites to duke it out on screen for supremacy. You can even unlock and play as a wide range of enemies, bosses, and NPCs from the game, and this is just incredible. How many characters can you choose from? Well, if you utilize a simple debug cheat code, then you can play as one of 45 different characters from within the game. Holy cow! There is a good reason that Guardian Heroes has become one of the most popular and sought after games for Saturn collectors. And I think it's because we all know, in our heart of hearts, that this is really the single greatest Saturn game ever made. No, it's not a 3D game. No, it's not made by Sega. It's not some epically long, super ambitious melodrama, but it allows you to fight this many crazy 2D sprites using these insane combos and colorful super moves across 3 different backgrounds, all at the same time? This was truly insane. It's often said that the Saturn was originally designed to be a 2D powerhouse, and in Guardian Heroes, this legend proves to be true. This is a 2D powerhouse indeed, and I love it. Though it makes me kinda sad to think of all that could have been on this system if Sega had just stayed true to their course and not attempted to fudge their 2D hardware into something it plainly was never meant to be. What if the Saturn had more games like this to begin with? And costs like, say, $100 less than it did? We'd all probably be saluting the Sega flag and taking our kids to specially designated Sonic the Hedgehog schools for mandatory Sega reprogramming. All hail Sega! All hail Sega! All hail Sega! All hail Sega! What a shame. So is Guardian Heroes really a must-have game for the Sega Saturn? Do you even have to ask? Guardian Heroes is the reason to own a Sega Saturn, and sad proof of what the console was really actually capable of. Number 3! Sega Rally Championship. 17 out of 40 people said that they thought Sega Rally Championship was one of the top 5 must-play games for the Sega Saturn. In 1995, a lot of Sega fans were pretty annoyed with the launch of the Saturn in May of that year. Not only was the Saturn frustratingly hard to actually find in stores, but it launched with a weak library of games that did little to impress. Most disappointing were the home ports of popular Sega arcade games, Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. Daytona USA was a fairly popular arcade racing game based on NASCAR, a sport that was mostly popular with middle-aged Southern dads in the 1990s. That included my own father, actually.
Oh, when I think of all my hard-earned tax dollars going to pay a bunch of little twig boy bureaucrats like you, it just makes me want to... Oh, God, it just...
But the version of Daytona USA that was available at the launch of the Sega Saturn, well, it was just atrocious. The game was an ugly, chugging, flickering, butchered mess of misfiring polygons, low draw distances, and total wonkiness. Compared to Namco's Ridge Racer, which launched with the Sony PlayStation in the same year, Daytona USA was an embarrassment. So bad that you can bet it contributed to the Saturn's overall low sales in North America, a real backfire of a game. And then came Sega Rally Championship in the fall of 1995, and Sega completely redeemed themselves with an outstanding racing game that stood apart from everything else on the market. Again, the obvious comparison being made in the fall of 1995 was with Namco's Ridge Racer, a popular game with beautiful graphics, over and against Sega Rally Championship, a game that was more about gritty realism and learning to control high-speed turns in the mud. These games were like polar opposites of each other, and if you ask me, I'd rather play Sega Rally Championship any day. The game still suffered from a lot of draw distance issues and pop-up around the track. However, since Sega Rally takes place on a narrow, rough mountain road, the action on the track always remains smooth and in focus. That is, unlike Daytona USA, the entire track itself never disappears right in front of you. Just a few trees or objects in the background. The frame rate is also drastically improved, and the sensation of speed is awesome. But the gameplay itself was just next level at the time. Unlike Ridge Racer, where your car handles like a stationary toy that's occasionally turned against a green screen backdrop, the cars in Sega Rally Championship squeal, spin, and swerve like actual tons of metal careening on rough and wet surfaces. Collisions have more impact. You have to plan each turn and master drifting around the competition on muddy mountainous terrain. And there are a lot of gripping close calls as you careen alongside walls, trees, and cliffs. Graphically, Sega Rally Championship is less colorful and cartoony, but the semi-realistic art style looks like the best games ever made for the 3DO. Kinda like a pixelated diorama or a 3D model that's come to life, and I mean that as a compliment. It looks great. With all these cars on the tracks and dirt being kicked up beneath your tires, there's a ton of motion going on all at once and everything is buttery smooth. The backgrounds in the levels, while still prone to lots of pop-up, are stunningly beautiful with crisp mountain scenery, European villages, lush forests, and brilliantly colored skylines reflecting different times of a long racing day. There are only 4 possible tracks to race on, and each can be completed in around 3 to 4 minutes, but believe it or not, this was actually a lot of diversity at this point in time. But probably the best and most surprising aspect of Sega Rally Championship was that it managed to have a 2-player mode, which could be achieved by either linking 2 Sega Saturns together on 2 separate monitors, or in glorious split-screen mode. The price to do this is that the track and backgrounds degrade and struggle to exist ever so slightly more than in 1-player mode, but the game remains fundamentally unchanged. Only now you and a friend have to kind of cooperate with each other to place high in each race. So while you're both technically competing against each other, you're also sort of wishing each other the best, as your mutual progress in the game depends upon both of you finishing as high as possible. Ridge Racer, the Namco game often regarded as one of the main reasons to get a PlayStation in 1995, it had no split-screen multiplayer. So therefore you couldn't play it with your friends. So therefore it contributed to loneliness and isolation. So therefore it contributed to the fall of human civilization and moral decay. Sega Rally Championship, on the other hand, brought people together in harmony to build up something beautiful for the future. It's almost like it was a gift from God. But even better is the fact that Sega Rally Championship was compatible with the Sega Arcade Racing Wheel, a peripheral empowering players with analog steering controls that were much closer to a true arcade experience at home. With the racing wheel equipped, navigating Sega Rally's many hard turns and wild off-road surfaces becomes as fun as driving an actual car full of screaming children to Chuck E. Cheese. And for the absolute ultimate racing experience, you could get 2 arcade racing controllers hooked up to the Saturn at the exact same time, granting 2 supremely blessed individuals 2-player split-screen arcade racing perfection. Sega Rally Championship, with its 4 short but beautifully designed tracks and heavy emphasis on drifting around hard turns and realistically struggling to steer through rough terrain, was probably the single greatest console racing game ever made at the time of its release in 1995. Maybe it wasn't the prettiest or the flashiest, but it was sincerely the most lifelike and fun to play by a wide margin. So is Sega Rally Championship a good fit for the top 5 must-play Sega Saturn games? Absolutely. Even today, despite its brevity, Sega Rally Championship is an extremely fun game to play and easily one of the best Saturn games ever made. Number 2. Radiant Silvergun. 17 out of 40 respondents named Radiant Silvergun as a top 5 Sega Saturn game. Radiant Silvergun is a very popular vertical scrolling shooter that was developed by Treasure, the makers of McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, simultaneously for both the arcades and the Sega Saturn in the summer of 1998. The arcade original was out in May of 1998 and the exceptional Saturn version was released in July, exclusively in Japan, where the shmup subgenre still retained some kind of devoted fan base. But in North America, no dice. Here, the scrolling shooter was a niche genre that had faded out of favor with the advent of fighting games. Further, by 1998, Sega of America had completely given up on the Sega Saturn and were instead retooling for what they hoped would be their big comeback with the launch of the Sega Dreamcast in 1999. We all know how that turned out. Therefore, Radiant Silvergun, despite being one of the best games of its kind ever made, wouldn't get an official North American release until like 2011, when it appeared on Xbox Live. So what's the big deal? Why do so many people think Radiant Silvergun is such an incredible game? Why has the price of the Japanese Saturn version been driven all the way up to over $200? Well, let me tell you, Radiant Silvergun does a wonderful job taking advantage of the strengths of the Saturn, combining 2D vertical scrolling gameplay with complex 3D backgrounds and polygonal graphics. Even with the non-stop massive storm of crazy shit happening on screen all the time, the game manages to run at a buttery smooth 30 frames per second for almost the entirety of this sometimes ludicrously difficult game. Only at certain periods during the final stages, in their complete and utter disregard for human decency, does Radiant Silvergun start to sort of chug with slowdown. And the arranged red audiobook soundtrack by Hitoshi Sakamoto really sets a dramatic tone, adding to the massive scale of everything that you're up against in this dazzling ball breaker of a game. After all, you're up against an evil artificial intelligence that's already destroyed the entire world, a fact that's conveyed through an epic anime storyline that's legitimately not completely boring and stupid. But what really sets Radiant Silvergun apart is its highly polished and innovative gameplay. While not quite what you could call a bullet hell game, Radiant Silvergun comes dangerously close to reaching that same level of insanity in many instances, and is rich with numerous surprises and obstacles that simply must be memorized by the player over time. Fortunately, the player comes pre-equipped with 6 weapons, which make good use of every single button on the Sega Saturn's ample 6-button controller. Though if I'm being honest, the best way to play this game would be with a 6-button arcade stick, since there are even more attacks, including an incredibly useful sword attack, which can be utilized by pressing combinations of buttons all at the same time, a task that's much easier to do with a large arcade stick and buttons. So rather than juggle endless distracting power-ups, the player can choose to use any of the possible weapons in the game at any point without limit. In fact, the more you use a weapon, the more powerful that weapon becomes over time, by way of a unique leveling up process that can go all the way up to a screen-destroying level 33. A number that, frankly, makes me uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean that just any weapon will do given your immediate circumstances, and thus the point of Radiant Silvergun is to learn through painful trial and error which kind of weapon best suits the specific situation that you find yourself in. For instance, these pink projectiles that often fall across the screen like cherry blossoms in the spring can all be absorbed by using the Radiant Sword. And if you absorb enough of these pink things, then you can unleash the mighty Hyper Sword, a powerful screen-clearing weapon that also grants you a moment of much-needed invulnerability. Thus, it's less about reflexes and more about figuring out how to use the right tools at the right time in order to successfully navigate Radiant Silvergun's lengthy and daunting levels. This has led many to describe this game as a kind of puzzle shooter, and you know what? That's a pretty good description. Radiant Silvergun is a phenomenal game and is theoretically easily one of the best games ever made for the Sega Saturn. However, given its very late release date and the fact that it was never released outside of Japan, I balk at the claim that this could be called one of the top 5 must-play Sega Saturn games. That is, one of the 5 best games that could have sold the console to Western gamers. Yes, objectively, the game is pretty great, but the fact is, it wasn't even on the radar in the mid-90s, when the Saturn was actually on the store shelves. How can we include a game that people weren't actually going to be able to play? I mean, the game could have technically been imported by way of mail order, and you might have attempted to modify your Saturn by installing a mod chip, but in 1998, these were steps far beyond what normal people were willing or able to take. So for this reason, while I agree that Radiant Silvergun is an exceptional game, I cannot include it on a list of the top 5 must-play Sega Saturn games, since for a game to be included on this list, it must also be playable, and the sad fact is, back in the mid-90s, it just wasn't, for nearly all Sega Saturn gamers in North America. Number 1, Ichiban! You know, the really telling thing about my inquiry on Twitter or X or whatever is the fact that only one game, a single game out of all the games people mentioned, was mentioned more than 50% of the time. And that game is our number 1, Nights into Dreams from 1996. Nights into Dreams was named a top 5 must-play Sega Saturn game by 22 out of 40 people who responded to my inquiry. That is to say, only 55% of the people responding thought that Nights into Dreams is a top 5 game, and therefore this also means that 45%, or almost half of all people, actually disagreed. To them, Nights is merely a top 10 game, or worse. Once again, this strange phenomenon implies that either the Sega Saturn library was so freaking amazing that there is simply no way to formulate a broad consensus about the absolute best games at the very top, there's just too many to choose from, or it implies that the Sega Saturn game library was mediocre, and that very few games even exist to fill this high of a tier. There simply are no games that are universally loved or admired on the console. Well, when you consider Nights in some detail and the fact that this game of all games was the most frequently hailed to represent the very best of the Sega Saturn, then I think it's safe to say that we can go with the latter explanation over the former, because if Nights into Dreams is really the very best that the Sega Saturn could do, then it really had no chance. None at all. Now, I took a lot of flack in our lengthy Yuji Naka video when I repeatedly presented the case that perhaps Nights into Dreams is a bad game, or at the very least, not a very good game. If you recall from that video, I made a case in favor of the hypothesis that Nights into Dreams is essentially built upon the recycled remains of a failed 3D engine for a Sonic the Hedgehog game that Yuji Naka and Sonic Team never ended up making. There are a lot of little clues here and there that these wonky ground physics and this floaty high-speed loop-de-looping character were preliminary attempts to get Sonic up and running on the Saturn before Sega of America could finish their own Sonic Extreme by the Christmas of 1996, a game that also never came into existence. And I know this is very controversial, and I know that some of the relatively few people that actually had both a Sega Saturn and this game are very frequently deeply nostalgic for Nights into Dreams. Therefore, I think we ought to take a moment to more closely examine both the game itself and how the larger public might have received it back in 1996, if in fact they had bothered to play it at all. But first things first, we gotta address this myth that Nights into Dreams was or is a niche hidden gem kind of game, because a lot of young video makers are under this false impression. That's just not true. What is true is that the general gaming public that's alive and well today does not really know this game very well, but that's to be expected for two simple reasons. One, the game is nearly 30 years old, coming out before a large percentage of gamers were even born. And two, it was released on a console that few people bought even when the game was readily available. But let me tell you, in its time, in 1996, Nights was a very big deal, thanks to both heavy marketing on the part of Sega and an extremely receptive and enthusiastic gaming press that was all too eager to hype up anything and everything made of 3D polygons. GameFan here in September of 1996 declared Nights into Dreams a must-have game for the Saturn. Official Sega Saturn magazine in the UK went a step further, wondering whether or not Nights wasn't actually Game of the Year. In their October issue of 1996, GamePro, perhaps the most popular US gaming magazine of the time period, gave Nights into Dreams a near-perfect score, just 0.5 points behind Mario 64, which itself did indeed earn a perfect score in that very same issue. Nights into Dreams was front page news, and from about the summer of 1996 until Christmas of that same year, the game was virtually inescapable. Sega even released a new analog game controller intended to highlight Nights into Dreams as a big deal release, perhaps their biggest of the year. The controller and its analog stick were meant to highlight the fact that Nights was 3D, which is misleading because the actual gameplay is fundamentally 2D, and therefore a 3D analog controller wasn't really necessary. And actually, a lot of people prefer to play the game without it. The point is that this special controller, which could be purchased packed in with the game, highlights that Sega was anticipating something really big with this one. Nights was supposed to be the console's mascot in the same way that Sonic the Hedgehog was on the Mega Drive, and it was basically supposed to save the Saturn the same way Sonic had saved the Genesis. After all, it was made by the same dudes and everything. But despite all the hype and promotion, things didn't exactly play out any differently for Sega in North America. Despite having a heavily hyped 3D contender aiming to match Mario 64 or Sony's Crash Bandicoot, the existence of Nights into Dreams did little to nothing to improve the Sega Saturn's stale North American sales figures. And indeed, what little evidence survives indicates that at best, Nights was a modest success. Getting accurate video game sales figures from the 80s and 90s is extremely difficult, and there are a lot of contradictory stories online about which games for the Sega Saturn sold the best overall. But there is a consensus that Nights into Dreams was either the single best-selling game ever made for the Sega Saturn, or at the very least, one of the very best-selling games ever made for the console. And if this is true, I'm guessing it has something to do with the fact that Sega released Nights into Dreams as a pack-in game for the Sega Saturn in both North America and Japan at some point during or after 1996. However, being a pack-in game or being the very best-selling game on the Saturn doesn't really matter all that much, because the fact is, the Saturn just didn't really sell very well in general, and therefore even the best-selling games on the Sega Saturn would have all sold relatively poorly by logical necessity. For instance, consider that according to 1996 sales data at themagicbox.com, a dead website preserved by the Wayback Machine, Nights into Dreams sold over 392,000 copies in 1996, making it the 21st best-selling game of the year, at least in Japan. The best-selling game in Japan that year was the original Pocket Monster for the Nintendo Game Boy, which sold over 1.5 million copies. Number 3 was Paper Mario for the Super Nintendo, which sold just under 1 million copies. And number 2 and 4 were both the original Resident Evil, known there as Biohazard, and Tekken 2 for the Sony PlayStation, which sold about 1 million copies each respectively. So Nights into Dreams selling 392,000 copies in 1996 is pretty good for some random game. But if Nights into Dreams was also the pack-in game for the Saturn that year, and allegedly it was the best-selling game ever made for the Sega Saturn, then this demonstrates that by 1996, the Sega Saturn was pretty much dead where it stood. And despite the overwhelming positive acclaim from the gaming press, Nights into Dreams as a game just wasn't able to carry the console forward. Again, the hope was that Nights would do for the Saturn what Sonic did for the Genesis back in 1991, drastically boosting languishing sales, but that didn't happen. Instead, Nights and the Saturn itself were still drastically outsold, even by the freaking Super Famicom, a console that was at the end of its lifespan. How could this be? Well, honestly, I think it's because the game just isn't really that good. And despite what the magazine articles said praising Nights at the time, I think people had their own ideas about what kind of games they wanted to play, and Nights, despite all the hype and constant praise, just wasn't it. I can tell you personally, there were 2 reasons why I myself, a lifelong Sega fan, rejected the Saturn. First, Sega failed to continue to build on their popular gaming franchises. Like, imagine if Nintendo suddenly decided to drop the Super Mario Brothers, or The Legend of Zelda. That's sort of what happened with the Sega Saturn. Sega Lord X once made this brilliant observation about why he thought the Saturn failed, and I think it's 100% spot on. He pointed out that the Saturn just didn't feel like a true Sega product, insofar as few to none of the best Sega games were represented on the console. No Phantasy Star, no Streets of Rage, no Golden Axe, no Toe Jam and Earl, no Alex Kidd, no Sonic. They did have this weird, outsourced Shinobi game with digitized graphics that didn't really hit right, and Shining Force 3 came out so late that no one even cared anymore. Instead, we got all new, untested game franchises and a rough-looking port of 1993's Virtua Fighter, a dated arcade game with fairly fringe appeal in North America. The other big debut launch game that Sega was pushing in North America in order to get people to buy the Saturn was the original Panzer Dragoon. And in order to sell Panzer Dragoon alongside the brand new Saturn, places like Toys R Us were equipped with these kiosks that allowed customers to play a demo of that game. And it was from playing actual Saturn games at these kiosks that I found my second reason to abandon Sega. In short, I thought Sega's new 3D game franchises sucked. So, in 1995, at the age of 13, I was one of those customers, torn between either the Sega Saturn or the Sony PlayStation. The N64? No way, dude, that was for babies. I was never into Mario Brothers, and I didn't really like mascot games like Sonic the Hedgehog either, to be honest. I was a fan of Truxton, Thunder Force, Shining Force, Herzog Zwei, Phantasy Star, Shinobi, Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, and Mickey's Castle of Illusion. I freaking loved Sega, but at the same time I also had a 32X, and that thing left me feeling betrayed by Sega because, well, it totally sucked, despite the fact that I owned 5 games for it, or like 15% of the entire freaking game library. I had 0 games actually worth playing. I had always loved Sega. In the arcades, on the Master System, the Genesis, the Sega CD, but in 1995, it was like Sega had its head way up its own ass. But I still had to give the Sega and the Sega Saturn a second chance. The machine itself looked awesome. It was CD-ROM based, it had an awesome controller, and a really cool name, the Saturn. Wow. But the launch library was just not that interesting to me. Virtua Fighter was old news by 1995. And I had already played it a ton in arcades. NASCAR racing was for middle-aged southern dads, and Clockwork Knight was obviously for small children. I wanted action, something exciting or adventurous, and Panzer Dragoon looked like it could be just the thing to make me get a Sega Saturn. I mean, it's a 3D space shooter where you get to control a freaking dragon. Imagine the worlds you could explore, the places you could go. But then I played it. I played it at a kiosk at Toys R Us. I played it, and I played it, and I played it.
What is this shit? This game sucks, dude.
It's a fucking rail shooter. You can barely control the dragon. You can barely do anything at all. All you really have to do is move this aiming reticle in the general direction of enemies, and you can easily and skilllessly destroy them all by way of auto-locking homing missiles. The biggest selling point, I think, is being able to change your camera angle, allowing the dragon to fly on autopilot while you shoot stuff off to your sides. But this only highlights how restrictive the gameplay actually is. It's 3D? Well then why can't I explore over there? Maybe if Panzer Dragoon were a light gun game, it would have been better, but instead it's like all I'm really doing is watching a bad looking CGI movie of a dragon flying around cheesy water effects, which is deeply marred by tons and tons of annoying pop-up every other second. I have to concede the music is beautiful, but for a 3D action game, playing Panzer Dragoon just felt so one-dimensional. My exact first thought after realizing how much I didn't like Sega's big new game was, why didn't they just make a sequel to Space Harrier? Space Harrier allowed for far more dynamic movement of your character. Being able to dodge obstacles actually mattered just as much as aiming your gun. Plus, it was already a well-established Sega franchise that people loved. It would have been awesome to see the world of Space Harrier in true 3D. Being able to look off to the side in a Space Harrier game, though suicidal, would have been magical. But Panzer Dragoon left me feeling cold towards the Saturn, and it was at that very moment I knew I wasn't ever gonna get one. And you know what? I think that's how a lot of other people felt too, because untold thousands upon thousands of kids and young adults alike would have played Panzer Dragoon at one of Sega's many demo kiosks all across North America, and if any of them had actually loved this boring game, then I'm sure the sales of the Sega Saturn would have been much better than they were. And perhaps some people really did like the game, but the kiosk strategy would have still backfired with Panzer Dragoon because frankly, the gameplay is just so simple and repetitive. You could play the game the way I did for a few minutes at a time, over a few different visits to the video game department, and you would have seen and played your fill of Panzer Dragoon. Sure, it might have been limited to like one level, but there was nothing in Panzer Dragoon that would have made you care that much about ever seeing level 2 or 3, not for $50. It was a rail shooter, an easy one, and it honestly didn't look very good. Playable kiosks on paper are like the best way to get players hooked on your game. But it only works if your game has what it takes to get them hooked in the first place. And the game's potential can't be exhausted in a 5-minute play session. Super Mario 64 is a perfect example of this working well. You introduce the concept, the mechanics, but then it's obvious to anyone that there's a whole lot more stuff to explore and do in that game. Stuff you've never seen and done before. And a single play session at Toys R Us would have made you curious to find out more. But if your game is an arcade-style rail shooter, then not so much, man. If anything, all Sega did by making Panzer Dragoon publicly playable was to expose how kinda lame it was. Well, take everything I've just said about the problem with gaming kiosks and Panzer Dragoon and apply it all to Nights into Dreams, because just as Sega heavily promoted Panzer Dragoon in 1995 with kiosks, they did the exact same thing with Nights into Dreams in 1996, and to the exact same effect. So let's finally talk about Nights into Dreams as a game. The first thing that has to be noted about Nights into Dreams is that it is not a very good looking game. Now, there are a lot of positive reviews of Nights into Dreams that speak to the contrary. Everyone always comments on how colorful and creative this game is. Back in 1996, this was kind of to be expected because the bar for polygonal 3D graphics was perplexingly low. Games like Tomb Raider, which I've always thought looked atrocious, were hailed by critics as spectacular and revolutionary, despite giving you a headache and eye strain if you tried to play them too long. But surprisingly, a lot of contemporary reviews of Nights into Dreams praise the graphics as well. And I think that's probably because most of these reviews don't actually review the Sega Saturn version of the game, but rather the 2012 remake, which has been published on platforms such as Steam and Xbox Live. Yes, this version of the game looks pretty good, but we're talking about the 1996 Sega Saturn original, and even for the time, these graphics were not great. The resolution of the polygonal textures and characters are low quality, and the frame rate is jittery and inconsistent. However, overall, the flying portions of the game were fast and impressive for 1996. Few 3D games on any platform offered this much speed and color flowing across your TV screen. It had a psychedelic effect that matches the game's theming perfectly. But if you slow things down a bit and try exploring the levels on foot, then you'll discover that the textures and backgrounds are also constantly flickering and popping in and out of existence. The surfaces on the ground also constantly tear and warp, and everything is a blurry, jagged mess. These walking portions play like some kind of glitch. It's horrible. Thankfully, these walking portions are mostly completely avoidable, unless you fail to finish a level before the time limit. Therefore, for the vast majority of time, you'll be flying around as this sexually ambiguous, DMT-triggered machine elf named Nights, whose goal is to recapture all of the stolen blue and golden balls hoarded by the evil Nightmarens. The blue balls represent stolen ideas, and I can't help but wonder if this isn't some kind of heavy-handed reference to the fact that Sega of America was trying to make a 3D Sonic game without Yuji Naka's permission. Stolen balls indeed. Well, whatever the case may be, gameplay in Nights into Dreams is deceptively straightforward. Despite utilizing 3D graphics, Nights' flight path is 100% on rails, and therefore, Nights into Dreams utilizes 2D gameplay controls. You can move left, right, up, and down, but never into the third dimension. With the tap of a button, Nights can do a spin attack, and the shoulder buttons make Nights do a magical flip that leaves a trail of pixie dust that can also damage enemies. Under the right conditions, Nights' tail will turn yellow, and then you can even perform a bunch of neat acrobatic tricks by tapping the shoulder buttons in combination with the D-pad. As I've mentioned, the goal of the game is to move forward and grab all the balls, but in order to progress through the game, you'll also have to successfully pass through all the shiny golden rings in order to build up a high enough score. This too sounds deceptively easy, but the side-scrolling 2.5D perspective means you can't actually see what's in front of you as you breeze through each level at high speeds, and it's never clear where exactly you're supposed to go in order to make contact with all the right stuff. And this is where every retro gamer's favorite helper comes in to save the day. Brute memorization, homies! Yeah, memorize that dog! Yes, you will have to memorize whether or not Nights should go up or whether or not Nights should go down at various key points throughout the level to make sure you pass through all the right stuff and under the time limit. That's right, a freaking time limit. So if zipping around and exploring these colorful areas while doing endless loop-de-loop sounds fun to you, well, don't get too excited, bucko, because Sonic Team made sure to punish you for doing anything other than frantically gathering up all of Yuji Naka's stolen idea balls and flying through a predetermined path of rings as quickly and as accurately as you possibly can. Thankfully, the extravagant level designs found in Nights offers a fair amount of variety and a lot of DMT-infused creativity. There are 7 different themed levels with 4 different sub-levels each, and unique to each level is a boss that acts as a kind of puzzle you have to solve before going forward. So while a pessimist might balk at having to memorize linear level layouts in a so-called 3D flying game, the optimist might point out that you get to memorize a total of 28 different tracks, with the addition of 7 different boss fights. That's a total of 35 different things you get to memorize in order to master this game. And if you like the idea of perfectly optimizing your score in an old school arcade sort of way, then you're probably over the age of 50, and this could actually be totally awesome for you. Because frankly, once you get the hang of these courses and you're able to beat them in time, then this game can actually be very fun in short doses. Nights is the kind of game that you can just throw down and chill with in short intervals, once you've gotten to know it, and the soundtrack is frequently outstanding. I don't like all the casino slot machine sound effects constantly going off all over the place, but the music can be very nice, and so I can see how Nights into Dreams would have grown fondly within the hearts and minds of players who gave it sufficient time, back in the day. Well, not too much time though, because after all, Nights can be beaten in like 30 minutes, but you know what I mean. I have to concede, on the whole, Nights into Dreams for the Sega Saturn is a pretty okay game. I don't think it's great, and I personally wouldn't have wanted to spend $50 for it back in the day, but for what it is, as one of the cheaper Sega Saturn games, yes, it's actually fun. Mi piace, I sort of like it. So let's go over these 10 games one more time. The 10 games that appeared the most frequently in people's top 5 must-play Sega Saturn game lists, according to the 40 people that I surveyed, were Saturn Bomberman, Fighters MegaMix, Panzer Dragoon Zwei, Shining Force 3, Virtua Fighter 2, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Guardian Heroes, Sega Rally Championship, Radiant Silvergun, and finally, Nights into Dreams. At first glance, I think most people would agree, this list looks pretty darn good. The Sega Saturn was awesome. Why would anyone buy a Sony PlayStation? However, looking at this more carefully, I realized that what we're looking at here aren't necessarily 10 games that would have made the Saturn popular with consumers in the mid-90s, but rather, these are really 10 games that are popular with Sega Saturn collectors in the present day. This is a thing that comes up a lot for me. I noticed, for instance, that few people mentioned any of the Saturn's famous light gun games. Personally, I think any top 10 list of Saturn games ought to contain at least either Virtual Cop or Virtual Cop 2, but people weren't interested in these games, and I think it might be because they weren't thinking about the Saturn historically the way consumers saw the console as a choice to be made in the 1990s, a time when everyone had working CRT televisions that were required for light gun games to be playable. Today, getting a heavy, cumbersome, fully functional CRT television up and running to play light gun games is quite inconvenient and expensive. On top of that, playing light gun games also requires you have a functional light gun, which further complicates things. Thus, when it comes to collecting retro games, a lot of people simply don't bother with this variety. But that's not how people felt in 1995 or 1996 or 1997. Light gun games were actually still extremely popular, and the contemporary impediments to playing them didn't exist. And for sure, if you were to ask anyone after 1996 what the very best Sega Saturn games were, they would have put Virtual Cop near the top of the list. Yet today, Virtual Cop 2 wasn't even on the freaking radar? And that's only because today we approach the Sega Saturn with the mentality of a game collector who can arbitrarily choose our favorite Sega Saturn games without concern for release dates, availability, compatibility. We can treat the entire Sega Saturn catalog like it's this simple grab bag, and if we can afford it, we order any game we want online, except for one caveat, and that's the light gun games. They require more money, more equipment, and more workarounds. And that's why we didn't see any mentioned here in this video. Looking at this list again, I can see that yes indeed, it's deeply impacted by the game collector's mentality, which is also why only 5 out of the 10 games are actually reasonable candidates for being essential Sega Saturn games, which would have actually convinced real-life consumers to buy a Sega Saturn back in the 1990s. And perhaps this is the actual reason why there was no consensus about what constituted the 5 best games on the Saturn. Because with collecting, people are more motivated by prices, scarcity, and completeness than they are actual gameplay quality. Saturn Bomberman is a great game, but it was also kind of a late release and redundant. You didn't need to buy a new console to have a multiplayer Bomberman match with friends. Very similar games were already widely available on both the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. Fighter's MegaMix, another great game, was also redundant. Why would people buy this when they likely already either owned Virtua Fighter 2 and/or Fighting Vipers? Maybe dedicated fans would appreciate this, but Sega certainly wasn't going to sell any new consoles on the foundation of this game. Shining Force 3 was released way too late to matter, and it's only 1/3 of a complete game. And I think most people who recommend it are probably just emulating it, because Part 2 and 3 were translated and been widely available online for years. Panzer Dragoon Saga only had optimistically like 25,000 copies ever released in North America, which means you almost certainly weren't going to be able to play it even if you wanted to. A game that can't actually be played doesn't sell hardware. And Radiant Silvergun wasn't released outside of Japan. This leaves us with only 5 viable choices: Panzer Dragoon Zwei, Virtua Fighter 2, Guardian Heroes, Sega Rally Championship, and Nights into Dreams. So according to 40 people I asked online, these are the 5 must-play games for the Sega Saturn that would have sold the console to consumers. And it makes sense. These are all popular, highly reviewed games that would have been readily available during the peak years of the Sega Saturn's relevance as a console. But do these games stack up well against similar games on the N64 and PlayStation? Do these 5 games stack up well against similar games on the N64 and Sony PlayStation? Well, Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally Championship certainly do. Both of these games were arguably the very best in their respective genres at the time of their release. Tekken and Ridge Racer certainly had more glitz, but I'd rather play Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally Championship any day. Guardian Heroes is kind of a tough call. Today this is probably my favorite Sega Saturn game. It's got a lot of heart, and it's a great 2-player fighting game with a lot of replay value. However, I have to acknowledge that this game is also pretty niche, and has a fairly steep learning curve. I think we all have to keep in mind that fundamentally, video game consoles are children's toys, and the inaccessibility of Guardian Heroes certainly wouldn't have appealed to anyone under the age of like 12. It's not really a system seller. It's more like a solid anchor title, just the way other treasure games always used to be on the Mega Drive. Critically important games highlighting the greatness of the console, but like, not for everybody. What Sega really needed, in addition to Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally Championship, desperately, would have been a solid entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series. And you know what? Guardian Heroes proves that it could have been a straightforward 2D game, making use of the Saturn's powerful 2D processing and CD-ROM capabilities. Personally, I think Sega should have just dropped Knuckles Chaotix for the 32X, and they should have also dropped Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles for the Genesis, games that didn't really sell as well as everybody hoped anyway, and instead, they should have brought Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima back together to work on a 3rd Sonic game, specifically in time for the North American launch of the Sega Saturn. Now that would have been the sort of accessible, crowd-pleasing game that Sega could have used to stand up against Sony.
Thank you very much, Captain Hindsight.
You're welcome, ma'am. Just doing my job. Anyway, what about Panzer Dragoon Zwei and Nights into Dreams? Well, these don't fare so well. Mario 64 is factually a very different game than Nights into Dreams. But in the fall of 1996, that was the game Nights into Dreams was being compared to, and so we have to address this. It was a battle of the mascot characters, it was a battle of the pack-in games, and it was really no contest. Mario 64 is just a fundamentally superior game to Nights in every conceivable way. On the one hand, Mario 64 is a relatively vast game built around the capacity to explore fun, interactive 3D environments. On the other hand, Nights was a confusing 2.5D mess on rails. Neither game honestly looks very good, but the N64 did a lot better rendering stable polygons that didn't constantly stutter and flicker in and out of existence. Crash Bandicoot, meanwhile, was the other obvious comparison, and while I don't really think it's a great game either, it was at least graphically far superior to Nights into Dreams, and it featured straightforward, intuitive gameplay that doesn't require a 30-minute tutorial on YouTube to learn. Nights, by comparison, is confusing and frustrating. Where are you supposed to go? What are you supposed to do? What are all these balls and these machines? What do you do with these rings? Then you have to manage all of this stuff within such a short time limit. It's frustrating, and frustration is the opposite of fun. You can eventually learn it, but until you do, Nights kinda sucks. A lot. I get that people are nostalgic for Nights and that it was made to be this iconic game for the console, but the fact is, it didn't even work back then, despite all the heavy marketing and constant critical acclaim and free demos. This demonstrates to me that the whole endeavor was a huge mistake. If anything, I think this game actually drove people away from the Saturn. It certainly drove me away because it was just too weird. Similar to this is Panzer Dragoon Zwei, and we might as well throw the original Panzer Dragoon into consideration as well. During the botched launch of the Sega Saturn, the weight of the Saturn's future rested pretty much entirely upon this game series in North America, and frankly, it also couldn't generate sales. Like Nights, these games are provocatively original, but they're also just not that fun to play. It's a rail shooter! Name a single rail shooter after Space Harrier or Afterburner that was a major hit. Now name one that was a big enough hit to be a freaking system seller for a brand new video game console. There's just no such thing. The point of 3D games in 1995 was to be able to go in any direction, to explore, and these games frustrate that inclination with repetitive linear gameplay. Panzer Dragoon was the final straw, and playing it gave me my final reason for passing over the Saturn in favor of the PlayStation. And let me tell you, that turned out to be a huge mistake. Because despite the popularity of the Sony PlayStation and all the smack I've just been talking, at the end of the day, I really wish I had exposed myself to these Saturn games more back when they were still relevant. When I compare these games to the sorts of games I ended up with on the PlayStation, well, then I have to say that I prefer the Sega Saturn by a wide margin. In fact, let's just fix these top 5 games here to be something more doable for me. So let's drop Panzer Dragoon Zwei, and instead of the sequel to a rail shooter, why not Virtua Cop 2? The even better sequel to one of the best light gun games ever made. Now this is a game that really showed off how the Saturn was bringing the arcades into the home. It's not terribly long, but it's action-packed, and best of all, it supports 2-player simultaneous co-op. If you've never played Virtua Cop 2, then I'm sincerely very sorry, because it's awesome. Now let's take Nights into Dreams, which is a bit of a mess, and replace it instead with Shining the Holy Ark, an incredibly immersive and beautiful 3D dungeon crawler that does a much better job of showing off what the Sega Saturn was actually capable of doing. Yes, it's true this game is not the kind of metaphysically obtuse hogwash people would come to love from the Final Fantasy series over the next several years, but it was still a satisfying adventure in an explorable 3D environment. No rails here, baby. I'm out here spelunking with my nomies, and we're looking for some booty, yo. Did you know that Shining the Holy Ark is related to the original Shining games on the Genesis, and that it's also the spiritual precursor to Golden Sun on the Game Boy Advance? Believe it, baby, because it's the stone cold truth. Now these are 5 games I can get behind. This would have been so awesome. And of course I would have supplemented this collection with games like Shinobi Legends, Mega Man 8, Dark Savior, maybe Fighter's MegaMix. I would have been all in. So after all of this, do I still believe that the Sega Saturn lacked must-have games needed to sell the console? Well, not quite, no. I have to concede that the Saturn had, spread out over its history, sufficient awesomeness to carry its weight with consumers. However, it has to be said that the Saturn did have a shortage of the right kinds of games at the right times, especially JRPGs translated into English. And Sega also did a pretty bad job of supporting the console, even themselves. The reasons that the Sega Saturn failed are pretty obvious, and it has nothing to do with the fact that you couldn't get it at Walmart. And it wasn't as much the $400 price tag either, since the Saturn came with all the necessary accessories that the Sony PlayStation made you purchase extra, meaning the real cost of both consoles side by side was effectively almost exactly the same. No, the real issue was, in fact, the weak launch games, the small game library, and Sega's reliance on less than exciting on-rails games. Games like Panzer, Dragoon, and Knights, which made it seem like Sega didn't understand what 3D gaming was all about, which is sad, since, you know, they kinda helped pioneer it. If Sega hadn't spread themselves so darn thin with the 32X and their fruitless Sega Technical Institute in the United States, and had they allowed AM2 the chance to focus on a more polished port of Virtua Fighter, and had Sonic Team been allowed to get moving on a Sonic game for the Saturn prior to the launch of the console, and if Sega had preserved a place for 2D gaming as part of their strategy, then I think the Saturn would have had a great chance of survival, and I think third-party game developers would have had more faith in the system. And you know what? I think it could have reduced Sony's insanely oversold market share. Crash Bandicoot? Spyro the Dragon?
Mediocre.
So then is Saika right? And was the Sega Saturn secretly the best next-gen console during the late 90s? That depends entirely upon your tastes. I certainly like it more than any of the games I was told to love on the PlayStation. Ridge Racer? Final Fantasy VII? Metal Gear Solid? I just never liked these games the way all the critics did. But these Saturn games from my top 5, classic. At the same time, however, the Nintendo 64, that's where it was at, man. Mario 64, the Ocarina of Time, Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye, WWF WrestleMania, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Star Fox, the original Smash Brothers, Paper Mario, those games were phenomenal. Some of them remain among my very favorite of all time. It was with the Nintendo 64 that I learned to actually like Nintendo. It was a phenomenal piece of hardware, and it outlived my shitty PlayStation by decades. No, the Saturn doesn't have this secret untapped treasure trove of like 800 hidden gems that stayed in Japan. That's just not true. And no, there are no good 3D platformers or adventure games that come anywhere near the depth, scope, or quality of what you could find in Mario 64 or the Ocarina of Time. And no, there weren't enough RPGs released in English, which is a shame because classics like Lunar the Silver Star Story and Grandia both originated on the system in Japan. But for what it was and what it was able to muster, the Sega Saturn was still totally awesome, and I love it. I would put the Saturn on equal footing with the TurboGrafx-16, a limited game library with few home runs, but a significant number of solid line drives past first base, baby. It wasn't enough to win the World Series, but you know what, team? We had a heck of a good season anyway. And on that note, I just want to say thank you for watching. Did any of you all have a Sega Saturn? What are your top 5 must-play Sega Saturn games? Please let us know this and more in the comments. And I hope you have a splendid day. But let's be honest, if you watched this entire video, then it's probably already tomorrow. So have a great rest of tomorrow, and remember, somewhere out there is a $4,000 copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga that still needs a home. Do it for the children. Bye-bye now.